Oh, yeah, this morning we're going to be talking about election stuff. We're going to be talking about election interference and not so much the 2020. We're going to have to, I might have to make some reference to it, but I'm actually going to be talking about the interference that is current and ongoing. Not least of which is coming from already Gavin Newsom and the New York Times. So let's do this. That's probably enough intro, because, y'all, we got quite a bit to cover this morning, and and I have places to be. So, good morning, good morning. Like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about election interference type of stuff this morning. I have an article here from the New York Times, and I'm going to start with reading you just the tippy top of it, but then I want to make an important point related to the significance of it. Of course, I've grabbed this from the archive because we don't want to give the New York Times any more clicks than we have to. And the article is entitled, "The Worst People Run for Office," which I might add is a sentiment with which I can agree. And he says it's time for a better way. Again, a sentiment with which I can quite easily agree. However, this knucklehead, Dr. Adam Grant, this, skinhead, on the eve of the first debate of the 2024 presidential race, which is coming up on us. Is that tonight or tomorrow night? I'll double check that in a second, unless somebody in the chat can update me. I forget when the debate is, but it's this week. On the eve of the first debate of the 2024 presidential race, trust in government is rivaling historic lows. And not least of which, my friend, because of statements like the one you're about to make. Officials have been working hard to safeguard elections and assure citizens of their integrity. But if we want public office to have integrity, we might be better off eliminating elections altogether. Interesting. Now, I want to point out, while this is an opinion article, it is an opinion guest essay published voluntarily by the New York Times. And one might ask, why is that important? Well, let me clue you into a couple of details on that. We haven't talked about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in quite a while, but here's a ChatGPT summary of Section 230 generally. Kind of strips away some of the legalese and makes it a little more easy to understand. So Section 230 essentially grants online platforms a degree of immunity from legal liability for content posted by users. Now, there's some important key words in the sentence. Online platforms, liability for content posted by users. This means that platforms like social media sites, forums, and even search engines are not considered publishers of the content they host. This distinction is important because publishers can be held legally accountable for the content they produce and disseminate, whereas platforms are not held to the same standard. Okay, this stems from some early concerns with telecommunications generally, and those included that we didn't want it to be the case, and this is wise and reasonable. We did not want it to be the case that the communication system was held liable for the use of the communication system, most especially in regard to crime, which is to say, there was concern early in the development of telecommunication, of telephones, that, Ma Bell, for example, might find themselves in court in well, this was prior to RICO cases, but in what amounted to be a RICO case and being held liable for facilitating communications between organized criminals plotting a crime. Well, obviously, obvious thing is obvious. Obviously, we don't want to suddenly lose the ability for everyone to communicate with one another based on the concern that some bad people will use that communication to bad ends. Based on that argument, and this was a reasonable first position. Based on that argument, there was concern that certain mobile platform or certain social platforms, and this was even before we got into what we now think of as social media platforms. We're talking about comment sections. In fact, I think the first case that kind of began the crafting of Section 230, it was one of the companies like Staples or I don't remember which one it was, but it was one of the kind of big box office supply, electronic supply stores had started deleting certain comments in the comments section from articles on the site, and there was an argument about whether or not they had the right to do that, censorship of speech. Now, where Section 230 is concerned, vis-a-vis censorship, it's worth remembering that, it's worth understanding that the First Amendment does not protect you from having your speech censored by private citizens. So you have the right to speak, to say anything you want, to express yourself in whatever manner you prefer in public spaces, which are traditional public fora. That's public parks, government properties generally, sidewalks, anywhere that the public is allowed to gather. Where those rules stop protecting you is when you are on privately held property held not by a government entity. Now, it's also the case, however, that there are what we call reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, all of which must be narrowly tailored to serve a specific and compelling government interest, and none of which can be anything other than content neutral. Right? For example, it is legal, and there's a reasonable argument for it. It is lawful to say that within the courtroom, your freedom of speech is truncated generally because it is unreasonable during court proceedings for any old citizen to just stand up and start monologuing. Right? It would be disruptive. It would make the procedure difficult. It's a bad thing. It causes problems. Right? Like, for example, if you were to go storming into, I don't know, a Senate hearing chamber in the middle of a Supreme Court justice's confirmation hearing, waving banners and signs decrying some psychotic dystopian novel's future idea of how we should be killing our babies, for which I might add, no one was prosecuted or incarcerated. Another good example of what I think is a quite reasonable restriction is on the public streets directly in front of the homes of a Supreme Court justice. It is unlawful to demonstrate with the clear purpose of attempting to alter the outcome of an upcoming Supreme Court case. Now, of course, none of those people were prosecuted either. Now, it is also unlawful. Sedition is a thing. Now, if you go stand on a public street and say that you want to take up arms and overthrow the government has a compelling interest to censor that speech. That gets a little tricky legally, however, because that is not content neutral censorship. But we were told throughout the whole debacle with the 2020 elections, stealing the election, and all of the suppression of information from not just those of us who are nut job tinfoil hat guys that turn out to accidentally be right about literally everything and always, but from legitimate doctors who were saying, no, this vaccine is a trickier beast than you think, and you should be very careful before you accept it. But as all that censorship was happening on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., basically everywhere except for Rumble, which, by the way, if you're not already, you should watch this show on Rumble and follow us there. And with that, I'll say thank you to the 15 new followers that we picked up yesterday on Rumble. Thank you very much to you guys. But we were told throughout all of the censorship that, these are private companies. You know, if YouTube wants to censor your speech, YouTube can do that. We have learned, however, that a judge on Tuesday, this is from the 4th of July of this year, Xandermax says public disturbance less nuisance laws apply pretty much anywhere, unfortunately. Yes, let me come right back to that. You're touching on the thing that I was explaining with time, manner, and place restrictions. Let me come right back to that in just a second. From the 4th of July of 2023, a judge on Tuesday prohibited several federal agencies and officials of the Biden administration from working with social media companies about protected speech, a decision called a blow to censorship by one of the Republican officials whose lawsuit prompted the ruling. Now, this one in particular, this lawsuit in particular was related to censorship over COVID and the like, but is in part responsible for what we've seen recently. You know, I've already in this episode, I've said that the vaccines were not as effective as they told us they were, and the 2020 election was clearly and obviously stolen, and any person who believes differently is not paying attention. And that's fine now, right? The rules have been loosened on that, largely because of lawsuits like this one. Because what has been proved, right? This is another one of those tinfoil hat conspiracies that we spouted off as early as 2019. I started making these arguments. I think probably before that, but I've been saying for a very long time that the platforms that are engaged in censorship are not private entities sufficiently to be protected from legal repercussions of actually censoring people. And previously I was making the argument that because there is funding from the government, that many of these platforms are funded through government grants and the like, that they are sufficiently entangled with the government, so long as capital is fungible, that they're sufficiently entangled with the government to be de facto government agents. But what we have learned now is that not only was I right about that, the financial and fiduciary entanglement of these entities with government entities, thereby making them de facto agents, but in fact, many of the censorship policies which were put in place related especially to COVID and election interference were done at the direct direction and under duress and threat by agents of the FBI and agents of the Biden administration and agents of the government outside of, but working in enmity against the Trump administration while Trump was still in office. We've learned that it was in fact direct government involvement that censored and removed the Hunter Biden laptop story, which story on its own undeniably had a major effect on the outcome of the 2020 election. The Hunter Biden story by itself amounts to election tampering, which should see dozens, if not hundreds, of U.S. federal agents, elected officials, and employees at these various social media platforms incarcerated on charges of sedition, prior restraint, censorship, and the conduct of a conspiracy to defraud the American people, what amounts to a coup, which is what occurred. All of that is to come back around to the Section 230 argument. Let me remind you that the I pointed out the Section 230 situation, and here's what's important to remember. Online platforms, a degree of immunity. Well, the distinction, like it says here, the distinction is important because publishers could be held legally accountable for the content they produce and disseminate, which is to say that if you're in the business of producing what we call news, then you are responsible. Take a moment and think back to Nick Sandmann and his lawsuits after the libel that was spread against him. As a publisher, you are responsible for what you publish, which is to say that in this case, we are seeing the New York Times advocating for the elimination of elections. At the same time that we see this happening, at the same time that we see the New York Times participating in a maneuver to destroy our sacred democracy, they're trying to eliminate elections. And when I say that, I say it advisedly. I want to bring also to your attention this article, and there are several others to corroborate this. This is the older article. I want to come back to this one in a minute. Okay, I've got two articles here about Gavin Newsom and... Okay, so Gavin Newsom is lobbying the government in California to simply remove Trump from the ballot. And he's making the argument that because Trump was involved in inciting an insurrection vis-a-vis the January 6th event, that under the 14th Amendment, Section 3 provides that he cannot hold public office having engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Okay, there's a few things wrong with this. That January 6th was an insurrection activity is entirely and exclusively a fallacious label. It is public relations. It is weaponized propaganda. To call January 6th an insurrection, while at the same time there were occupied autonomous zones held by the opposition all across the country, is so disingenuous to border on complicity. Let me simplify that because I threw a lot of words in there. People who say the phrase January 6th was an insurrection should be considered, at a minimum, sympathizers with an enemy that actually conducted anti-American, territory-occupying military activity for a course over the period of a year. Now, as to the second piece of this, for Newsom to say that Trump can be barred from office and that he can be removed from the ballot on that basis in California, for him to be saying that now is an absolute miscarriage of justice. What he's doing is in clear violation of Donald Trump's right to a fair trial by a jury of his peers. Gavin Newsom is asking that the government take deleterious actions against a U.S. citizen who is, I might remind you, innocent until proven guilty. It should be said then that for Newsom to be demanding that California remove Trump from the ballot, and especially for him to be doing it in such a public way, Newsom is engaged, not theoretically or allegedly, but quite visibly, in not only election interference, but more explicitly and more immediately significant, jury tampering. Gavin Newsom, by demanding the removal of Donald Trump from the ballot in 2024, is committing two very, very, very serious crimes. That he is not even being investigated over them, one might say, is just a function of timing, because he's only just recently made the statements and taken the official actions. But I will be deeply surprised if there's any action taken against him. And that right there is the core of the problem that we have. It's the rules for thee, but not for me. We've been shown time and time again over the last more than 20 years, right? This goes back at a minimum, to the Nixon administration. Rules for thee and not for me, right? Because remember, with Watergate, oh, well, the cover-up was worse than the crime. Well, yeah, the cover-up was worse than the crime because the crime was standard operating procedure for the Democrats in every election in living memory at the time. The Democrats have, and it's not something that has changed. The only degree to which there's been any change in the habit of the Democrats to conduct illegal espionage against their political opposition is in the level of technology used to do it. Remember, Donald Trump said they were tapping my phones at Trump Tower, and all these lefties started making fun of him. Nobody uses wiretaps anymore. You're stupid. Okay, does that change the fact that you're collecting data illegally? That you're conducting espionage and intelligence operations against a U.S. presidential candidate, the apparent nominee, and after his election and inauguration, we now know that these activities were continued. So the Democrats, I cannot imagine a more clear-cut case of treason being committed by a political party than for one political party to literally conduct intelligence operations, espionage against the President of the United States of America. Not only do we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Democrat Party, most especially the Clinton campaign, after Donald Trump was inaugurated, and officially the sitting president of the United States, conducted electronic surveillance and various forms of espionage against the sitting president. But we also know that the same party has enjoyed extraordinary funding from foreign sources. So as much as I would go, as far as I would go as saying that Gavin Newsom should be investigated, tried, and likely incarcerated for the crimes of election interference and jury tampering based on these actions alone, I would go so far as to say that based on the activity of the Democrat National Committee over the last 20 years at a minimum, constitute unregistered foreign agent activity conducting espionage against the United States of America and her interests, in the furtherance of a conspiracy to defraud the American people. Rush Limbaugh used to say all the time, and it looks like he's, maybe he's about to have crept over that 0.4% of the time that he was wrong. Right, he was right 99.6% of the time. It's hard to get that last 0.4%. Well, here it is. The Democrats seek to eliminate elections. They're not just interested in stealing the election, in locking it down and making it look like, they're not just interested in pretending that we have elections, which we no longer have. They're actually interested in eliminating them altogether. That's what all the Trump indictments are about. They don't give a shit about Donald Trump. What they give a shit about, what they're interested in, is taking away the ability of the people to vote. we've seen over the last 20 years plus that the Democrats they're all about that censorship, right? Getting involved with, interfering with, threatening the social media platforms and forcing them to censor people, forcing them to illegitimately alter narratives, forcing them to participate in election tampering with things like the Hunter Biden laptop, suppressing stories about the occupied territories. Guys, you all probably heard about the CHOP, right? The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. First it was the Capitol Hill occupied something, and they changed it from that because of the connotations of the word occupied when they realized that everything I'm explaining to you about the conduct of an insurrection and the greatest failing of Donald Trump, which was that, right, the only thing Donald Trump really got wrong, other than the bump stock thing, was not deploying the National Guard to put down the autonomous zones. Those were insurrections, which were allowed to fester. There's still one in Atlanta, right? And we saw those occur. So you all heard about the Chaz Chop thing, right? I think that was the one in Portland, Oregon, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. What many of you don't realize, have not heard, unless you heard it on this show or one like it, is those occurred all over the country. At its peak, there were about 150 of them. They happened all over the place. Think about that. That means thousands of essentially guerrilla soldiers attempted to take control of the physical sovereign territory of the United States of America. And that information was hidden from you, and those activities went largely ignored by authority. It is fair to say that law enforcement as an entity surrendered all of its legitimacy with the toleration of the autonomous zones. Now, there are some fair arguments that law enforcement in this country surrendered all of its legitimacy before that, but that one right there is a pretty clear line of demarcation, where we learned that if you fly the right flag, and that's the Pride, Progress, BLM, if you're the right kind of ethno-supremacist or the right kind of child grooming pedophile, then you're allowed to do anything you want. Up to and including insurrection, election interference, and murder. That's where we've gotten to. That's where the Biden administration has brought us around to, right? That's where the Obama administration got us to. And all the while, it's happening as inflation skyrockets, prices skyrocket, and our standard of living is being intentionally destroyed by foreign-influenced, illegitimately selected criminals like the Biden administration. This week, tomorrow is the first debate for the 2024 GOP primary. Guys, it's a tough call. I think I'm going to have to figure out a way to watch that and the Trump-Tucker interview because, well, quite simply, I think Trump's move here is clever. The 2024 debate stage for the GOP primary, they're going to be the also-rans. Unless Trump is actually removed from the ballots. And to be clear, if Donald Trump is removed from even one state's ballot, then one will no longer be able to say with a straight, intelligent face that we had an election in 2024. If Donald Trump isn't on the ballot, that is the same as abolishing the election. Plain and simple. Especially if it goes the way that it looks like they're trying to go, which is Trump wins the primary so that the ticket is Trump versus Biden. And then Trump is removed from the ballot in any state at all. Even if it's California, where Trump had no chance of winning the state, that he now has no chance of winning any votes at all in one of the most populous states of the nation is sufficient to say that the election was de facto abolished. And that's what we're looking at. We're walking into a presidential election year where the party in office has used the weaponized Department of Justice to not only target and hamstring his primary political opposition, but to literally, without the legislature, without the ratification of an amendment, without any legal activity whatsoever, and yes, that statement includes a doubt of the legitimacy of all of the indictments, to eliminate one of the two candidates from the ballot. That means that there's not an election. That would be the end of democratic selection process and if a representative republic in this country. That would be the end of the American experiment. Quite literally. And then, okay. The one last thing I wanted to touch on real quick is I mentioned Gavin Newsom and what he's doing here. I want to remind you guys of this. Nearly 2 years after then California Governor Jerry Brown quashed a bill to force presidential candidates to release their tax forms, Golden State lawmakers have returned a nearly identical measure to the desk of Brown's successor. Now, California Governor Gavin Newsom has less than 2 weeks to decide the fate of the proposed law, which has provoked fierce criticism from Republicans across the country. It was disappointing for a lot of people not to be able to have confidence that a major presidential candidate and ultimately the president didn't have financial conflicts of interest. California State Senator Scott Wiener told CBS News Wiener authored the bill with fellow state Senator Mike McGuire. I think it's time to require that everyone already thought was required. That's not true. But here's the thing that I want you to pay attention to. July 15th, 2019. They tried, and Gavin Newsom was instrumental in this one as well. Going into 2024, this is not the first time that the Democrats have tried to eliminate one party from the ballot. They have chosen and dedicated themselves to the proposition of the abolition of elections. Democrats hate democracy. All the bullshit that they keep spewing about, oh, January 6th was a threat to our democracy. If that were the case, they would be dancing in the street for joy. They hate democracy. They hate elections. They want you to shut up and go to work, peasant. Pay your taxes, untouchable. Stop speaking. It's not your place, pleb. And Matt Parks points out, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. And you know what, Matt? I agree with you 100%. That is the correct operational mindset when you are at war. Yes, when you are at war, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. And I want you guys to take that to heart, because the DNC clearly has. Unverified Bear says, so Roseanne Barr was right? Yeah, I'm struggling with that too, Bear. I really am. Roseanne went on Tim Pool with Michael Malice, and she just goes, I don't think there's going to be an election next year. And I watched Tim Pool and Michael Malice laugh at her, and then the next day or two, they both put out videos where they said, we've given it some thought, and we think Roseanne might not be exactly right, but she might totally be right. And what they meant by that is what Roseanne explained was essentially that Joe Biden is just such a tyrant, such a monster, that he's just going to come out and declare martial law. There's a new pandemic, everybody's on lockdown, declaring martial law, elections canceled. Right? That's what Roseanne Barr said, and she was pretty clear about that. But this mechanism, waiting until Trump is the nominee and then just removing him from several ballots, has the same follow-on effect. That's the same as just straight up abolishing the elections. So keep an eye out for that. That's where we're going. And it will be time, absolutely, at that point, to be out in the street with signs and pickets at a minimum. Because they're not stealing your country, guys. They've already done it. Now they're trying to hold on to it. All right. Oh, this show was good, but it wasn't as much fun as I'd like to. I want to have fun on the show again, guys. I'll try to bring you something interesting beginning of next week. Obviously, this week, Cameron and I are going to end up having to cover the debate on Thursday morning. We're going to have to cover the debate and the Trump-Tucker interview. So maybe we can do something lighthearted tomorrow in preparation for the more somber story that will be Thursday morning show. So y'all be safe out there. We love you, and we will see you tomorrow.